According to NATO intel, Russia's artillery production is nearly 3 times more than that of the U.S. or Europe. A senior NATO official saying this has now become a, quote, production war. And the outcome in Ukraine will be determined by which side is better equipped. David DeRoche is an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Security Studies. David, this CNN report, obviously it sounds very troubling for Ukraine, but just how bad could this potentially be given where we are in this war right now?
It's potentially bad. I mean, what we've seen is that Russia is on a war footing and the West really isn't. We've been able to ameliorate this in part by purchasing artillery rounds from other countries, places like South Korea, Pakistan, and sending those to the Ukrainians. But the bottom line is, you know, we're still making automobiles and refrigerators and washing machines. Russia is on a war economy. And, you know, right now, the administration waited, I think, too long to try to mobilize a defense industrial base that really is dating from the 1940s. And now that modernization is kind of caught up in the whole Congress brouhaha over border security and everything else. So it's serious. Yeah. It doesn't have to be fatal, but it certainly hamstrings the Ukrainians. They can't do everything they want to do.
Yeah, well, you just mentioned Congress. Is it even possible for Ukraine and its allies, including here in the U.S., to catch up?
In the short term, but the big question is how long Russia can continue this pace. You know, Russia's under sanctions. Russian oil is what's paying for this, but there's a cap on Russian oil, and they're clearly running down their capital. The Russian strategy in the long term is to try to outlast the West and Ukraine and figure that at some point the West will get exhausted, will get fatigued, and they'll tell the Ukrainians, look, cut a deal. My fear is that if that happens, that won't be a peace. That'll just give the Russians 5 years to rearm and then do it right. You know, the big quote from the war describing the Russian general officers is all the stupid ones are dead. This is, you know, we have to support Ukraine now. And there are things we could do. The U.S. military hasn't dug into its own stockpiles yet. They're afraid to do that because they're worried that it won't be replenished by Congress. But, you know, this is all a function of making the case for the war. There hasn't really been any significant level of sacrifice in the West yet. And I think that it's up to the administration to point out the strategic significance of this.
You just talked about fatigue and just this question of where this war goes from here. Pope Francis drew some criticism from Ukraine recently for saying that they should have the courage to negotiate. Do you think those comments at all were sort of symbolic of where some folks are in the West, is thinking that there has to be some sort of negotiation from Kyiv, give something up for this war to ever come to an end?
Yeah, you know, Stalin famously remarked dismissively of another pope, how many divisions does he have? I think my question here would be, how many generals does he have? Because he's getting bad advice. Look, what we have here is not a territorial dispute over, you know, 1 or 2 villages or rivers or basins. This is an existential issue for the Russian state. And make no mistake, you know, this isn't something that they'll negotiate away. A peace agreement is just a temporary pause in fighting. And during that pause in fighting, you know, Russia will not renounce its revanchist claim over Greater Russia, which they see Ukraine as an integral part of, and indeed its claim over the former Warsaw Pact. So Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and possibly Poland will be the next stops here. So I think His Holiness's remarks were ill-advised, ill-timed, and not particularly helpful, and not reflective of the world as it is today.
All right, right now we're in the spring. Weather's getting a little bit nicer all over the world. Where does this war go over the next few months, and specifically, what are you watching for?
Well, what I'm watching for is the Ukrainians typically advance in the summer. The spring is actually a period of sort of static fighting because the ground that had been frozen turns to mud and it becomes very hard to move. The Russians have lost a huge amount of armored vehicles and don't really have the ability to move in a large tactical way. So if they are able to do that, the Ukrainians had to withdraw from Avdiivka. They've reestablished other defensive lines. The question is whether the Russians can push somewhere along those lines while they have this temporary advantage in artillery. The question is, can that wait until Ukraine gets other weapons, most notably the F-16, which will have the ability to deliver bombardments, and additional supplies of artillery. If Ukraine can hold out until then, I'm confident that they will be able to significantly dislodge the Russian forces, possibly recapture Crimea. And if that happens, then I think we can get to a settlement. The bottom line is the Russian army has to be decisively defeated, or else we're just going to see a pause in the fighting.
All right, David DeRoche with the Near East South Asia Center for Security Studies. David, thanks for joining us.
Later on the